welcome everybody. I'm so glad to be with you this evening. I'm excited to spend a few minutes with you this evening drawing and learning about the molding. So we're going to have a good time. Hope you all brought your sketchbooks and a pencil or a pen, because one of the most valuable things you can do during this class is draw along with me and save those notes, because they'll be an invaluable reference for you going forward. So Sonia, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And if you'll just give me a thumbs up and make sure that you see what I'm hoping you'll see, which is the introductory slide.
It looks great.
Great. Well, let's kick it off. Welcome to the Introduction to Classical Moldings. We'll have part 1 tonight, and we'll be teaching part 2 next week. But tonight is the drawing portion of the class. So it's great fun. We've kind of learned to draw over Zoom, and I'm hoping you enjoy it. Make sure to have your notebook or sketchbook and pencil available. And after a little bit of introduction, we'll start to draw together. Looking forward to it. This slide is a beautiful illustration of the parallel of the classical orders by Vignola. I think it's a nice backdrop to put up while I tell you a little about the origin of this class. So the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art has always taught the classical orders as one of the key aspects of their core curriculum. And whenever we used to do an orders class, the orders class might last 4 to 6 hours, quite an extensive class where you learn in great detail how to construct the elements, architectural elements of the classical orders, and a wonderful drawing studio class. And usually the first hour of that class was a discussion of the moldings, because the moldings are the building blocks of the orders. And we were having a bit of trouble getting people to attend the orders classes because they were so long. We had to offer them typically on a weekend because they were just kind of too long for an evening class. And so the strategy we developed to try to kind of shorten the class a little bit was to decouple the discussion of the moldings from the orders and teach it as a separate class. That way, the orders classes themselves could be easily accomplished in 3 to 4 hours. And then we'd only need to teach the moldings once. And once you had taken the moldings, then you could take all the other orders classes and you would have that knowledge, which you'd bring to bear during the orders class. So that's what we did. We decoupled it and started teaching this class, which was developed as a in-depth discussion of the moldings. It did 2 things. One, as I said, it allowed us to shorten the orders classes, which was a big asset. We could teach it on a weekday evening, for example. But the other thing it did, it allows us to dive a little deeper into the moldings. And it's a really interesting subject. It allows us not just to learn to draw them and learn the shapes and the names of them, but it allows us to talk a little about the philosophy of moldings and the strategy for using them. So that's what you're in for in this class. And let's get going. This is a wonderful drawing by my good friend Dom Forte, showing the alignment of the elements of classical architecture with the human form. Good architecture speaks to us. The elements of architecture define a grammar and syntax of a language. And when architecture is doing its job, it's using that language to tell us stories. Stories about architecture itself, about physics, about structure, and the construction of it. And stories about us, about our culture, our values, our aspirations, and our nature as human beings. In order to begin a study of classical architecture, it's logical to begin with the moldings. They are the alphabet of the language. They're the bits and pieces out of which most of what we understand as classical architecture is made. But what are classical moldings? Simply put, the moldings are simple, linearly extruded shapes that are based on platonic solids. The moldings are the smallest physical units, the atomic units, if you will, of classical architecture. They're the smallest bits that we can break classical architecture down into and still have them retain identifiable characteristics. So in that very literal sense, they are the atoms of classical architecture. Starting with the moldings is appropriate because they crystallize in microcosm many of the ideas that define classicism itself. What are the purpose of moldings? What do we use moldings for? Well, first, pragmatically, moldings are often used to embellish or conceal intersections between adjoining surfaces. They're often used as applied embellishment to otherwise plain surfaces. But much more importantly, moldings are the basic building blocks of the language of the orders of classical architecture. To the thoughtful classical architect, the moldings are not something to be applied in an additive, superficially decorative fashion, but they are the fundamental units from which the basic form of the architecture is built. I want you to start to think of moldings in this way, not as trim to be added to spice up the architecture, but as the fundamental parts that we use to build up architectural elements. Moldings provide important fine-scale detail and visual interest through the rendering of shade and shadows upon their surfaces. Moldings are important transmitters of information about tectonics. In other words, the structural logic of the architecture. More about this idea in part 2 of the class next week. Moldings are also important compositional elements, which help create a fractal hierarchy of scale, where they mediate between the scale of the very large and the very small, between the scale of the building form and the scale of the human form. In that way, they help shape buildings into places which are engaging and comfortable for people. For example, consider this building. You may be familiar with it, you Southern Californians at least. This is the Pasadena City Hall by Arthur Brown from 1927, one of the great classical buildings in Southern California. Here's another beautiful photograph of the great central dome of the Pasadena City Hall, one of the great achievements of the American Beaux-Arts, and we have it right here in our backyard. So if we look at a building like Pasadena City Hall from a distance, say from 1,000 meters or so, like this photograph, we appreciate it as a form, as an overall shape against the sky. And it's really engaging us. It's this beautifully proportioned domed shape that ascends and is silhouetted against the sky, and the flanking wings of the building that are lower on the sides kind of draw it out into the landscape. It's a really engaging, beautiful shape. But let's get closer. Here at the scale of 100 meters or so, not only can we still take in the building form, but we're starting to pick up the details of the architecture, the elements of classical architecture start to become apparent. We see columns and entablatures and pediments and sculpture and balustrades. So the individual elements of the architecture start to come alive at this scale. And if we come closer yet, say the scale of a few meters, the distance of a few meters, now the individual parts of those elements become an important factor. And this is one of the important aspects of classical architecture that often distinguishes it from modernist architecture. Is a lot of modern architecture is concentrated on the form, the overall form that we saw in the first photograph. But as you zoom in on it, the architecture becomes blank, unadorned surfaces, mirrored glass, very, very sparse detailing. And so the architecture no longer speaks to us in this way. But classical architecture is very different in that regard. And I think you can see why, that it operates on many different scales. And we even get closer, and here we start to see the individual moldings. And this is one of the great values of moldings, is that they provide a level of detail and visual interest at the closest scale, at the human scale. Here we're about a meter away from here, the base of the columns on the facade of that building, and we start to see the beautiful rendition of shade and shadow on the surface of the individual moldings, and it speaks to us. That's what I mean by a fractal hierarchy of scale. So a quick chat about references for classical moldings. This is a list of books, which should have been in the handout that you received, the PDF that was sent out. So you don't need to scurry and write all this down. You should probably have it in your PDF. But just to go over it, these are references that I like to use in the studio. An in-depth study of the history and the philosophy of moldings in the literature of classical architecture is a lifelong pursuit. We don't have time for that tonight, but this is a list of books that I've found particularly valuable in the studio. They're ones that I use and my staff uses, and I recommend to you. First, important treatises, both from the Renaissance and more recent. Sebastiano Serlio's treatise on architecture from 1545. Serlio was a really influential Renaissance architect, and his treatise is very strong on the description of different building types. So in that sense, it's concerned with form, but it's also really good on moldings and the embellishment, the decoration of the moldings. So I highly recommend Serlio. A very famous treatise with which many of you may be familiar, The Four Books of Architecture by Andrea Palladio. This is the famous Quattro Libri, probably the most famous of the Renaissance treatises. This was published first in 1570. There's a wonderful MIT Press edition in paperback that's available on Amazon with a blue cover. I highly recommend it. Probably the most famous of all the Renaissance treatises, but it's really readable. It's a wonderful book. In modern translations, it's very readable and understandable and accessible. Palladio includes in one of his 4 books a full description of his version of all the orders, which is fascinating. There's also a book on Palladio's measured drawings of Roman buildings. Palladio toured sites in Europe and Western Asia and documented them in measured drawings, the treasures of the Roman buildings. And he includes his drawings of those antiquities in one of his 4 books. Really wonderful resource for moldings. It's like the Roman architects are speaking through Palladio to us and teaching us lessons. It's marvelous. Also, interestingly, Palladio's book is can be considered a modern architectural monograph in a sense, because one of his books consists of descriptions of his own work. Buildings that he designed, villas that he designed for idiosyncratic clients, and he tells the story of how he was approached to design a certain building and what the client was like and what the constraints of the design were. And it's really wonderful to read about that. And in that sense, it's like a modern monograph that we're all used to. Next is Chambers, William Chambers, a treatise on the decorative part of civil architecture from 1759. William Chambers was George III's court architect. George III was the king that we rebelled against in the American revolutions. So we've kind of demonized him a bit, but he was actually a pretty sensitive fellow and an artist, appreciator of the arts, and a pretty good amateur architect. And William Chambers was his tutor. Chambers' treatise Treatise on the Decorative Part of Civil Architecture is really a wonderful book. It's filled with beautiful engraved plates on all of the elements of classical architecture, but it's particularly good on small scale elements. That's why I go to Chambers, for things like doors and windows and fireplaces. And of course, at that scale, it includes a lot of interesting detail on moldings. So I recommend Chambers highly. Then we go to some more modern books. The first one is The Theory of Moldings from 1926 by C. Howard Walker. It's a bit of a rare book, but you can find it. But it's the only book that I know that is dedicated solely to a discussion of moldings and the theory of moldings. It's very, very interesting. And the version I have includes a wonderful introduction by Richard Sammons, the contemporary classical architect, and includes a wonderful dissertation on molding theory and molding use that's invaluable. A lot of the information that Mr. Sammons included in his introduction to this book has been influential on my point of view. Next is William Ware, The American Vignola from 1903. This is a book that we use every day in our studio, and a copy of which sits on most of my staff's desk. It's kind of the Cliff Notes of classical architecture. It's not terribly creative, but it's really thorough and really useful as a desk reference. So it's very sensibly laid out, very, very straightforward. And if you need immediate information about any of the elements, any of the orders or things like that, Ware is a terrific resource, and on the moldings as well. And you'll see many drawings from Ware in the lecture this evening. It's really excellent as a quick, well-organized desk reference. And then Robert Adam, Classical Architecture. This is the contemporary classical architect, Robert Adam, a really wonderful architect from Great Britain. He won the Driehaus Prize for Classical Architecture in 2017, so he's an important contemporary practitioner. And his book is really wonderful. It's organized around plates with accompanying essays. So you can open the book anywhere, and on one side, you have a plate illustrating the concept, and on the other side, you have an essay describing it. So it's really terrific. You don't have to read it front to back. You can open it anywhere and learn something. Really wonderful format. And he's particularly good on moldings, embellishment of the moldings, the fine scale character of the architecture. I also recommend that you read a series of short articles that I wrote for Traditional Building Magazine, which are available online. And the URL links are in the PDF that was sent out to you. They contain much of the material from this class, and they nicely encapsulate, I think, my point of view on the moldings and their importance. So I encourage you to look those up online and read them. But by far and away, the most important resource is your own sketchbook with notes taken from classes like this one from the ICAA. It's a rare day at the office that I don't refer to one of my sketchbooks. And I recommend that you bring a sketchbook, the same sketchbook, to all of your classes on the moldings or on the orders, and keep that information as a resource. Because not only do you learn a lot from drawing in your sketchbook during a class, but it becomes an important resource down the line when you're at your desk with a design decision to make, to be able to refer to those drawings in the future. So it's really, really important that a good classical architect do that. Here's a great example. This is a page from a sketchbook by Quinlan Terry, the great contemporary English classical architect, one of my favorite architects. And this is just a random page from his sketchbook. And he's showing a building on the left that he clearly did it's an older building that he did a measure drawing of. You can see it's not a particularly fantastic sketch, frankly. It's a quick sketch showing the basic elements of the architecture with dimensions and proportions noted onto it. Very useful kind of drawing. It's not a beautiful drawing, it's a informational drawing. And that's the kind of drawings we want to fill our sketchbook up with, in a sense. It doesn't mean you can't make them beautiful. The ones on the right are detail drawings, which are quite lovely as drawings, but they're not especially elaborate. And they're really more intended for informational purposes. They're intended to capture an idea or capture a configuration so that you can go back sometimes many years later and refer to it. This is a plate of the moldings from William Ware from the American Vignola that we just discussed. This engraving is part of the book that was published in 1903. The most straightforward way to categorize the moldings is by their geometry, by their shape. And that's what we'll do this evening. The moldings fall into 4 geometric categories: straight, convex, concave, and compound or inflected. What follows tonight is the core module of our studio class tonight. Together, we will now draw all of the basic moldings in each category. So I'd like you to draw freehand in your sketchbook following my lead. Draw them all at a similar scale and label each one with their name. We're talking about a drawing, it's probably about that big around, okay? It doesn't need to be huge, doesn't need to take the whole sheet. In fact, it's better if you can accumulate several drawings on a page, depending on how big your sketchbook is. Here's a good example. This is a page from my sketchbook. And these are the kind of drawings in the upper right that we want to try to achieve. You'll see a bold line that gives the outer border of the shape, the configuration of the shape, and then you'll see some lighter cross hatching. You can use cross hatching, you can shade with the side of your pencil if you want. If you're using watercolor, you could watercolor it. I imagine most of you are using a pencil or a pen, so a light cross hatch is good, but you want to show the solid part of the molding with a shading or a cross hatching. That way you don't get a kind of figure ground oscillation. You know which part is solid and which part is out in the open. Sometimes adding 45-degree lines, such as these examples, is an easy way to show a 3-dimensional quality and give you an idea of what the molding actually looks like in space. You can even add shading if you're ambitious, such as you see in these drawings, but it's not necessary to do that to capture the basic shape. Sometimes just the 45-degree lines are great, and I'll give you an inclination of how we do that as we move along. Another page from my sketchbook showing the kind of simple drawings that we're looking for. In the lower left, we see a Scotia molding. We'll talk about that a bit later. And what that kind of looks like. And then on the right and in the center, you get a little feel for how you can cluster different moldings together to create the elements of classical architecture. Okay, off we go. Get your sketchbook and your pencils ready. The first category is the straight moldings. As you might imagine, these are moldings which have flat surfaces and no curvature. And the first one is the fascia, the fascia. So I'm going to stop my screen share now. And I'm going to share with my iPad and my Apple Pencil, and we'll draw together, okay? So here we are. You should see my whiteboard. And the first of the moldings, as I said, is the fascia. Fascia. Fascia, of course, means face. And the fascia is really, really very simple. It's a linearly extruded flat vertical surface. So if we have a wall, for example, the fascia extends from it like a band. So let's use a thick line to indicate the fascia in section, which I've done here. And then we can use a thin line and we can actually draw those 45-degree lines if you want. And that gives it a bit of a three-dimensional quality. Like that. So you can kind of imagine what it's like in space. And then let's shade the solid part. So I'm at an advantage because I have this very groovy whiteboard, which allows me to use this marker. That is a really great way to kind of crosshatch. But use your pencil or pen, and you want to crosshatch the solid part of the molding. So I'll give you, if this is our first one, so I'll give you a little chance to make sure you're caught up with me. And what's kind of cool on my whiteboard is I can move this thing around, which is really great. And that's the fascia. Okay, so I'm going to stop share now. And we'll go learn a little bit about the fascia. So as I said, fascia means face or band. The word fascia also refers to a band or a sheet of connective tissue in anatomy. So that's yet another biomorphic reference or anthropomorphic reference. A fascia is a linearly extruded continuous flat surface. It's seen as a standard feature in the entablature of all of the orders, in the architrave and in the corona, and we'll take a look at that. It's also often seen as horizontal banding or string courses. Here's a plate showing the column and entablature of the Tuscan order, and this is from William Chambers from his treatise on the decorative part of civil architecture. The book is filled with wonderful plates like this that are very, very informative. The corona, and I'll show you here, I can bring up my laser pointer. The corona is this band up at the top here, and you can see that's a fascia. It's a linearly extruded flat surface. Similarly, the frieze, which is this portion of the entablature, is also a fascia, and the architrave, the lower band, is also a fascia. This is a building that many of you may know of, the Villa Capra or La Rotonda, the famous Villa Rotonda outside Vicenza in Italy by Andrea Palladio from 1592. It's a photo I took out of a cab window a very long time ago, but I think it captures this building really well. It's one of the most famous houses in the world. And here's a close-up of the Villa Rotonda, and you can see this banding. We might call that a band or a string course. There's actually two steps in it, but that's a fascia. And this gives you a feeling for how a fascia might be employed as an element of architecture. Another example, we saw photos of the Pasadena City Hall before. Well, here you can see these bands that run around the building and around this pedestal for this obelisk. You can see it down here as well. Those are fasciae. That's a fascia. Okay. So that's our first molding. Our next molding we want to talk about, the next straight molding, is the fillet. The fillet. So I am going to stop my share here. Oh, sorry. Bear with me just a moment. There we go. Okay, I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to share my iPad again. And we'll draw the fillet. The fillet. Fillet. And a fillet is also a linearly extruded flat surface. So I'm going to get a little heavier line weight here. Like that. When it extends out from the surface, we call that a raised fillet. So we can use a lighter line here. Let's draw those 45s together. You can do this freehand, no need for straight edges. Let's try to work on our freehand drawing. And then we'll shade the solid portion, which is over here. That's a raised fillet. Shade the solid portion, and that's our fillet. Okay. Now, fillet can also be depressed into the surface, and we call that a sunk. Oh, let's use black. A sunk fillet. And that's one that's depressed into the surface. So a sunk fillet is something like this. And then if we draw our light lines, our 45s, like that, that gives you a feeling for what a sunk fillet is like. And then let's shade the solid portion again. In this case, the fillet is depressed into the surface, so we call it a sunk fillet. Give you a moment to catch up with me. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll go back and learn a little bit about the fillet. So as I said, the fillet is also a linearly extruded flat surface. It can either protrude from the prevailing surface, which we call a raised fillet, or it can be recessed from the prevailing surface. In that case, we call it a sunk fillet. So I'm sure you're asking yourself at this point, what is the difference between a fascia and a fillet? After all, they're both flat surfaces and they extend horizontally. And the difference is one of hierarchy and purpose. A fascia is a dominant molding, a primary shape. The fillet is generally smaller and secondary. It's a separating molding. It's usually subservient to other dominant moldings adjacent to it. We often see fillets as separators between larger, more complex moldings. It's used to provide crispness of delineation between moldings when they're clustered together in a series. So let's see how that works. So here's a three-dimensional view of a very simple Tuscan cornice. And there are three fillets appropriately in a subservient role to separate and give definition to the other moldings. And those three fillets are at the top up here, between this crowning molding and the corona here, and then down here separating the two parts of the bed molding. Three fillets. So here we can see them identified in cross section. Those are the fillets. You can see they're smaller and they're used to separate the other more dominant moldings. This is a plate from Sebastiano Serlio from his treatise, Renaissance treatise. Serlio, as I said, was a great Italian Renaissance architect. And this shows three cornice moldings, three rather elaborate clustered groups of moldings. And you can see between the moldings are fillets, for example, here, or here, or here, or here. And that's the primary use of the fillet, is as a separating molding. Okay, our next shape is the splay, or sometimes called the splay face. The splay. So I'm going to share my iPad again, and we'll draw the splay together. There we go. The splay. And a splay is really just an angled face. It's not vertical, it's not horizontal, it's an angle somewhere in between. So we might have a wall and a fillet. Now we learned about a fillet, and then we might have an angled face. And then perhaps another fillet, and then a floor, for example. It's a common kind of molding we might see. This surface right here is the splay. So we can draw our 45-degree 3D lines here if you choose to. Don't need to, but it kind of gives you a feel for how the molding would look in space, right? Like that. Okay. And then use your pencil or pen and let's shade the solid part, which is over here. And that's the splay. You'll often hear people call it a splay face. That's the splay. Okay, let's go learn a little about it. Okay. So as I said, display is simply an angled straight surface. Cabinet makers and millwork people will usually call this a chamfer. And so you'll hear that word a lot, chamfer. But it's another word for the same kind of surface. So if we look at millwork, for an example is the edge of a counter, for example, or a tabletop will have a chamfered edge. Well, that's a splay face, another name for the same thing. Often in traditional architecture, you'll see a splay face at the top of a foundation wall of a building, where it mediates between the thicker wall of the foundation below and the thinner wall above, as in this detail from the First Parish Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts. This shape is pragmatic in this kind of application because it's effective at shedding water. So you'll often see it as a device to shed water outboard on buildings, as it is in this example. Here you can see the splay face right here. Here's another example. This one is from St. Monica's Church here in Santa Monica, 1925. Same kind of detail. You're going to see a lot of St. Monica's in my lecture because we're parishioners at St. Monica's. My daughter goes to school there. So I've taken a lot of photos over the years of St. Monica's Church. It's a wonderful limestone building with lots of wonderful classical details. So it's kind of a treasure trove for photography, and I'm always there. So it's a great opportunity. But here you can see that splay face at the foundation wall here, where it's very effective at shedding water. You can see it also in the background here. Another example, this is also at St. Monica's. This is one of the little windows into the confessionals at the church. And you can see the sill of the building here. That's a splay face. And it's there precisely to keep water from soaking into the building there. It sheds it quite effectively. And that's something that you'll often see. Okay. So that's it for the straight moldings. Our second category are the convex moldings. These are curved moldings which extend outward, which are convex. And the first one, very important molding, is the ovolo. The ovolo. So I am going to go to the whiteboard, and we will draw the ovolo together. Ovolo. And as you might imagine, ovolo means egg. It's easy to see why. Reminds us of an egg. That's certainly where the name came from, ovum, egg. So the ovolo is most often based on a circular geometry. So sometimes what I like to do when drawing these is to draw a guide circle. And you can do this in a light pencil, for example. I'm going to use a dashed line here. But we can draw a guide circle, and we can even draw some axes, a vertical and horizontal axis of the guide circle, and it's circle with that radius. So the ovalo is a quarter of a circle in section. So the ovalo, we might have a fillet here and say a ceiling. And then we have a quarter circle, and that's the key part of the shape. And then let's add another fillet to define it and a wall, for example. That's an ovalo. It's a quarter circle. So we can draw that shape, and then we can draw again our 45-degree 3D lines, give it a little character, give us a feel for what it might look like. In space, we can draw our quarter circle there. And then complete our fillet at the top, and then our ceiling plane. And that is an ovalo. Now we can also shade the solid portion. This is a big meaty molding, so there's lots to shade. But you want to shade the part that is solid. Like that. That is an ovalo. Now I said the ovalo is most often seen as having a circular geometry. Most often, but not always. We also might see an ovalo with elliptical geometry, for example. Let me do that in black. So it might, instead of being a circle, it might be an ellipse. And that's fine, it's still an ovalo. And so it might look something like this. Still an ovalo, but more often than not, you see it as a quarter of a circle. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. So I'll stop share here. And now we'll take a look at the ovalo, some examples. So as I said, ovalo means egg. Sometimes we'll call it a quarter round, and you'll hear cabinet makers or carpenters call it a quarter round, which is perfectly descriptive, perfectly appropriate, but a quarter round is an ovalo. So here's a good example. When it's at the top of a column, like we see here in this example, this is a Tuscan column, and this shape right here is an ovalo, quarter round. You can see it in profile over here. When it's in that position at the top of a column, sometimes we call it an echinus, which is a Greek word, which means sea urchin, especially at the top of the column there. That shape we'll call an echinus or sea urchin. And it's easy to see why, because that shape is very similar to the shape of a sea urchin shell. So that's why it's called that. If you took one of these and turned it upside down and put it on top of a column, you'd have an echinus. So some examples, here we are again at St. Monica's, and we can see these brackets are ovalos. They have a fillet at the top here. to kind of define it, but this shape is an ovolo. Another example, this kind of rustic limestone and terracotta column. The abacus at the top here is an ovolo, even in a rough and rustic form. And when they come together on a corner, you get a 45-degree shape there, but that's an ovolo, quarter round. The ovolo is often decorated with an egg and dart motif, which you see here. It's the ubiquitous classic embellishment of the ovolo. When you see egg and dart, it's an ovolo. It's the classic embellishment for that molding. The egg and dart dates to the early Greek period, and there are different stories you'll hear about its origin: life and death, the spear and the egg, male and female, the spear and the egg. I think there's a lot of symbolism involved in that sort of alternating of opposites, and we'll see that very often as a theme in the embellishment of classical architecture. But when you see an egg and dart molding, you're 99% certain that it's an ovolo molding. And if you look here, you can see, imagine this was an ovolo and the shape defined by the edge of the spear here, or the dart, that's a quarter round, and the rest of it was sculpted away and sculpted down to create the eggs and to create these beautiful kind of pockets that the eggs sit in, the wombs that are holding the eggs in a sense. So it's really, really beautiful embellishment, but it starts as an ovolo. Okay, let's move on. Our next one, we've got lots of material to cover, so I'm going to keep moving at a fairly brisk pace. So try to keep up. Next is the torus. The torus, and you can see it here. Didn't want to leave that. Forgive me, pushed the wrong button. Okay, I'm going to stop share. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. And I'm going to share my whiteboard and we'll draw the torus together. Minor technical difficulties there. The torus. Plural tori. And torus means, interestingly enough, cushion. And I think you'll come to understand why. So again, the torus is almost always semicircular in geometry. So if we start with a guide circle, it's a good idea. By the end of this, you'll get really good at drawing nice circles freehand. And some axes are helpful. Okay. So the torus is a half a circle in geometry. So if we have a fillet at the top and bottom, and say it's on a wall, so we'll have a wall surface here, then the torus is this half a circle like this. And that's a torus. So we can sort of expand that in 3 dimensions using these 45-degree lines. We'll draw those little fillets there. And you can see how the fillet acts to kind of separate the molding from the wall, for example. And then we'll draw our circular shape and then just kind of take that 45-degree up like that. And then we'll have a little extension there and a bit of wall up there. And that's our torus in 3 dimensions. As we've done before, let's shade the solid portion. This again is another big meaty molding, lots of volume. So a fair amount of shading to do here. And that's the torus. Cushion. Now, as we learned with the ovalo, the torus is similar in the sense that it's almost always seen as being semicircular, but it doesn't need to be. It could also be elliptical. For example, we could have an elliptical torus. So if we draw an ellipse here, like that, there's nothing that says we couldn't have an elliptical torus as well. And you do see them sometimes, like that. And that's the torus. It's a very big, expressive molding, and we'll learn a little about that as we go on. Okay. So let's learn a little about the torus. As I said, it means cushion, and it's really appropriate. The torus is almost always seen at the base of walls and of columns. And when it's used there, it conveys a sense of weight bearing. It's almost as if the wall or the column above is pressing down on a soft material and it's squishing out. And that's one really useful way to think of the torus, as something that's expressing, sending us a message about the bearing of weight from above. It almost always appears immediately above the plinth at the base of a column. And you'll see it in various forms at the base of columns in all of the classical orders. So here's a good example. This is the base molding from the giant Ionic order at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. By John Russell Pope. And here you can see those beautiful, big expressive tori here. There's a major torus at the bottom, and then a minor torus at the top. We call this configuration an Attic base. It's the canonical base design for the Ionic order, although you'll see it used in creative orders of all kinds. And it consists of a minor torus at the top, a scotia molding here, and we'll learn about that a little later, and then another major torus at the bottom. And that's the Attic base. Here's a pilaster of the same design, the Attic base. Again, this is the pilaster, one of the pilasters at the Breakers, the Vanderbilt Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. And here again, you can see that Attic base design, the minor torus, and then the scotia, and then the major torus. I think this image also shows how beautiful these moldings can be at a close range, and the beautiful rendering of that soft shading on their surfaces. It's very expressive, very beautiful. Another example, this is a column capital designed by Quinlan Terry, the contemporary classical architect. This is a drawing by his son, Francis Terry, and this column capital features a beautiful big torus that you can see in that kind of basket weave carved version at the bottom there. And it's really expressive. It's saying I'm bearing the weight above and it's squishing out. It's really speaking to us architecturally. And here's the finished column capital carved in marble. And I think you can see how that torus is speaking to us structurally. It's expressing weight bearing from above. The arch is coming down and bearing down, and it's squishing out. Next is the 3/4 round. The 3/4 round. So let's draw that one together. I wish I had a fancy name for it, but we really don't. We just call it the 3/4 round. Three-quarter round. And by now you've, I think, kind of seen how this works. So let's draw a guide circle together. Like that. And we'll draw some axes like that. So as you might imagine, this molding takes it another step further, and it is 3/4 of a circle. So we might have a little fillet here, for example, and then we go 3/4 away around. 1, 2, 3. And then we might have another fillet, for example. That's our 3/4 round. We can kind of draw, and it's basically, it just looks like a cylinder in a sense, right? So we can draw that. And that is our, we can even draw this here. But that's a 3/4 round. And then let's shade this together. This is the meatiest of all the moldings, I think. So lots to shade. But that's the 3/4 round. Okay, let's go learn a little bit about this molding. So the 3/4 round is often represented as rope with a twisted or braided embellishment. We'll see some examples of that. It's very often seen as a column element or a rope-like element that's pushed into a corner, for example, as in this drawing. And we'll see some examples of that. So here you can see it perfectly. This right here is a 3/4 round, and it's shown as a cable or a columnar-like element tucked into a corner. Same thing with this column shaft down here, can be seen as a 3/4 round. Very common to see it that way. This is at St. Monica's again in Santa Monica. And another example of that, again at St. Monica. So here's the 3/4 round molding, and it's tucked back into this corner which is something that you see very commonly. And we talked about it being like rope. Well, here's an explicit example. This is carved into a rope-like embellishment, so it looks twisted, and you'll often see it as twisted or braided decoration. But it's a 3/4 round. Okay, we'll keep going. The next one is the thumb molding, So I'm going to share my whiteboard and we'll draw the thumb together. So the thumb molding can be seen in a way as kind of a special case of the ovolo. That's one way to think about it. It's similar, but it has a little more complicated geometry. So typically the thumb, sorry, gotta pick the right tool, thumb. And it's easy to see why it's called the thumb molding, because it's shaped a bit like the surface of the pad of your thumb. But it's typically elliptical in shape. So we could draw an ellipse like this, and we can give it some axes just to help us orient ourselves. Excuse me. So the thumb molding then is usually 1/4 of that ellipse. So we might have a fillet here, and then the thumb is this shape. So it's a bit like an elliptical ovolo, but it has its own name. Sometimes we'll add a little extension here, like that. And that's called a quirk. It's a funny name, but it's called a quirk. And so this then that I just drew, I would call a quirked ovolo, or a quirked thumb rather. So we can draw our 45-degree lines again. We'll draw this little fillet here and the wall below. And then we'll draw this shape kind of mirrored up here, like that, and that. And the quirk is this thing right here. And that's just a way to make the molding even more expressive by continuing that curve up and giving a place where you can capture a really dark shadow. It's a nice touch, quirked molding. And then let's shade the solid part together. And then we'll have our thumb molding. It's really a lovely shape, and I think a very expressive shape. Very organic. And there's our thumb. Okay. I'm going to keep moving. So I am going to now go back to the PowerPoint and let's learn about the thumb a bit. So here's an example. This is a base molding at St. Monica's again. This is a thumb molding in a prone position. And we say a prone position, that means the molding is usually upside down from its normal orientation, and it's usually at the base, at the bottom, near the ground. This is a foundation detail at St. Monica's, and this molding is a thumb, and it's quirked. You can see it keeps going, and creates that little shadow line, which if there was sun shining on it, you'd see a nice dark shadow there. So it's a nice expressive touch. Another example, this is a very famous building in Manhattan, the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, Midtown Manhattan. And if you look at the shape of this beautiful fountain here, it's a thumb, this shape right here. You can see the curvature starts out soft at the bottom and then it starts to accelerate as you come up. And so it gets tighter at the top. And you can even see what we might call a quirk right here, which is giving that beautiful dark shadow. But you can see in profile, that shape is a thumb. Next, we have the bead. The bead. So let's draw the bead together. Bead. And a bead is very similar to a torus, typically just smaller. So if we draw a little guide circle here, then a bead is simply a half round. And that's a bead. Very straightforward. Sometimes we'll cluster multiple beads together, like this. Sometimes with a little sunk fillet between them. You'll see that often, particularly in cabinet work and stuff like that. We call that reeding, like it's a cluster of reeds. So we'll call that reeding. So going back to our original bead here, let's draw 45s. Give it a little feel of the three-dimensional, like that. And that's a bead. And then we'll shade it. And that's our bead. Okay. So let's go back and talk about the bead a bit. Now I know what you're asking, and I'll answer your question. The small half round is called a bead, and it's often used as a binding molding or to accentuate other moldings. As I mentioned, closely clustered bead moldings together is called reeding. And it's often embellished and decorated in a bead-like decoration, literally like beads on a string. And we'll talk a bit about that next week when we talk about the embellishment of the moldings. But what is the difference between a bead and a torus then? Again, it's a matter of hierarchy. It's the same thing that we saw with the fascia and the fillet. A bead is a subservient molding. It's usually used to separate and delineate adjoining surfaces. So as I said, the relationship we saw between the fascia and the fillet is the same as between the torus and the bead. It's a matter of hierarchy. So let's look at a few examples. Here's a beautiful drawing by Francis Terry from Quinlan Terry's office. This is a drawing of several views of elements of the Ionic capital and base moldings. You can see in the lower right here, we talked about the Attic base, which is that's fascinating. I used to be able to give you a laser pointer, but it's not giving it to me anyway. We can see here the two tori separated by that scotia molding. That's that Attic base. But look closely here at the volute of the column, this scroll. If we look at the side view of it, we can see these moldings right here, which are beads. They're separating this torus, which is sort of like a band around the material or the fabric of that volute. And then adjoining it, separating it from the volute itself are these two bands, and those are beads. You can see them here too. Very often seen as a separating molding like that. Another example, this is a plate from Chambers' treatise, William Chambers' treatise, but it's describing an order by Palladio. This is the entablature of the Basilica in Vicenza by Palladio. And you can see here separating the regions of the architrave down at the bottom. These are beads. There we go. So you can see them right here. Okay, let's keep moving. May go a little bit long tonight, but it's worth it. The next category is the concave moldings. These are curved moldings which are depressed from the surrounding surface, not concave, but or not convex, but concave. Curved moldings which are depressed from the surrounding surfaces. And the first one is the cavetto. Very important molding, the cavetto. So I'm going to bring my whiteboard up and we'll draw the cavetto together. Cavetto. Cavetto means little cave. And it's easy to see why. So most of the time the cavetto is semicircular in geometry, not always, but often. We kind of think of it that way. So let's draw a guide circle again. With axes like that. So the cavetto is in a way the concave analog of the ovalo. It's a quarter of a circle. So we can, maybe we'll draw a ceiling plane and a fillet up here like that. So then the cavetto is this quarter round concave molding like that. That is the cavetto. And we can draw our 3D lines here. There's a little fillet at the bottom. And then we've got our quarter round shape. And then we have a fillet at the top here. And then our ceiling. And that's the cavetto. And let's shade the solid portion again. You can do this with your pen or your pencil. Crotch hatching is fine, or just shading, scribbling, just anything to kind of indicate what's solid and what is in the open air. And that's our cavetto. As with the ovalo, the cavetto can also be elliptical in shape. We often see that. So we could draw an ellipse, for example, and we can construct a cavetto out of that as well. And that's fine. But more often than not, you'll see it as a quarter of a circle. Okay. So let's learn a little about the cavetto. As I said, the cavetto means the little cave. Sometimes cabinet makers or millwork folk will call it a cove molding, and it's derived from the same root, cave, but we'll call it a cove molding sometimes. It's usually semicircular, but as I said, it can be elliptical. It can take on different kinds of shapes. So some examples. I love this photograph. This is from the First Parish Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and photo I took because I was just charmed by the lovely little angel here with wings, and her face is kind of washing away over time. It's really kind of mysterious and lovely. But if we look at the top here, at the abacus at the top of the column here, this is a cavetto right here, quarter round concave molding. It has a bead underneath it that separates it from the rest of the capital, and it has a fillet at the top. So fillet, cavetto, bead. Another example, this is again from our favorite church, St. Monica's, and this band that runs around the church at about 10 or 12 feet above the ground is a cavetto. You can see it right here. This one is likely elliptical if you measured it, but it is a cavetto, and you can see it wrap the corner, so you can see it in strong profile here. And again, below that, we have a separating molding. It's a bead. So it's a perfect example of the bead as a separating molding as well. And another example, this is an entablature and pediment detail from a Quinlan Terry country house, really magnificent house. And you can see here that this bed molding up here is a cavetto. If you look at the joints between the pieces of stone or the shadow, you get a feel for the shape of that molding. That's a cavetto. We also see it down here under the other bed molding below the lower part of the pediment, a cavetto. Okay, our next molding is the half hollow. The half hollow. So I will bring up the whiteboard and we'll, oh, sorry, push the wrong button there. Bear with me. There we go. Okay. So we will draw the half hollow together. The half hollow is, in a sense, kind of the concave analog of the torus. That's a good way to think of it. So I wish, this is another one, I wish we had a prettier name for it, but we just call it the half hollow. If the ancients had a prettier name for it, it doesn't survive, as far as I know, to the present day. But we can start our half hollow by drawing a guide circle again. So let's draw ourselves a guide circle. Going to get really good at drawing good round circles after this class, I guarantee it. Okay, and then our half hollow is just a half segment of a circle. So, you know, we have a wall here, say, and so the half hollow is just a half hollow surface like that. Very simple. We can draw 45s again to give it a 3D character. And we can draw this up here. And then we'll just kind of connect the dots like that. And that's our half hollow. Again, the half hollow is like the other moldings. It can also be elliptical in shape rather than semicircular if a shallower look is desired. It can certainly be elliptical instead of circular. But most often you'll see it as a segment of a circle. I'm going to pick up the pace because we're over schedule, so we're almost near the end. And that's the half hollow. Okay, so let's talk about the half hollow. I have a really good example for you. So this is a wonderful building in Los Angeles that I highly recommend you visit. It's the Second Church of Christ Scientist in the West Adams district in LA. It was built in 1910, and the architect was Alfred Rosenheim. It's a wonderful example of a full-blown Corinthian classical church, domed church. In Los Angeles, wonderful building that few people know about. It's also wonderful because it's entirely clad on the outside in glazed terracotta, which is quite remarkable. Here's one of the entrances of it, and you can see those heroic columns left and right. We're seeing the base of it. But all of the decoration that you see on the outside here, all the fluting of the columns, all the doors around, it's all cast terracotta that's glazed and fired. It's quite remarkable. All of those individual pieces needed to be designed. Here's the bases of the columns, which are stone, they're granite. But the above that, for the column shaft, this is all the glazed terracotta up here. And the columns have entasis, they have tapering. So each piece of the column had to be designed to allow that taper to take place. Quite remarkable detail. And if we look closer at the columns, we can see the fluting here, and you can see these are pieces of glazed terracotta. But those flutes are half hollows. That's the whole point of me showing you this wonderful building, is that these flutes are exactly a half hollow. So it's a quarter circle or a half of a circle depressed into the surface to make those flutes. Perfect example. Next one is a 3/4 hollow. I'm going to avoid drawing this one mostly because it's one that you almost never see, and it's a very rare molding, but it is the concave analog of the 3/4 round, and it's a 3/4 of a circle sunk into the surface. It's very rare, and in contemporary practice, you rarely see it. And any of you know why? The reason is that it's very difficult to manufacture because you have to have some kind of tool that digs out that 3/4 hollow. It's very hard to make. You can cast it. It's very hard to carve it, and unless it's very large. Where you do see it is in Gothic work a lot, because these elements are usually very large, like in the Gothic church, and so workmen could get inside and carve out the stone. So this is an Italian Gothic window from the 13th century, and if we look closely, we can see three-quarter hollow voids in the surface of the elements of the architecture. These are Gothic arch moldings. It's a good example. Okay, our next molding, a very important molding, is the scotia. And the scotia, a super important molding. So let's draw that one together. Hang in there with me, we're almost there. Scotia. It's a pretty word. Scotia means darkness. And I think it'll be easy for you to see why that's the case. So the scotia can take on a lot of different shapes. It's usually elliptical in shape. So if we draw an ellipse kind of on an angle or a bias here, that's usually how you see the scotia constructed. So draw that with me. Then the scotia takes on a concave character that's a segment of that. So you might see a wall here or a adjoining surface, and then the scotia usually takes on a segment of that surface, and that's a scotia. A very expressive concave molding. So we can draw these 45s here to give it a little distinction. But that's a scotia. And then let's shade the solid part together. Now the scotia can have lots of different shapes, and you see it manipulated by master architects in lots of different ways. There's all sorts of varieties of scotiae, and we see it in all sorts of different guises. It could be very vertical and very shallow. Let me do this in black. So it could be very attenuated and vertical like this, or it could be very deep and shadowy. Like this. So our scotia could be something like that, or it could be very deep and carved really deeply into the surface. Those are both scotia. Okay, let's go look at some examples. So as I said, Scotia means darkness, and it's easy to see why. It's a deep molding that usually has a dark shadow in it, and it's used wherever that dark shadow is desirable to separate elements often. So it'll often be between two convex moldings, and you have that deep shadow between two tori, for example. It's commonly seen as separating the tori and the base moldings of the Ionic and the Corinthian orders. So we'll look at some examples here. Here's Scotiae from Greek antiquity. On the left is a detail of the Attic base at the Temple of Apollo in Didyma. That's 330 BC. And on the right is the base of the columns at the Temple of Athena, Priene. That's 334 BC. But you can see these beautiful, big, expressive Scotiae here, there, and there. And then here we see this beautiful shape of the Scotia between the two tori of the base. That's that Attic base again. Here's the Attic base and Scotia at the Acropolis in Athens. Here you can see it's all weathered away, but you can see that minor torus. Then we see a Scotia and a major torus. And you can see how it provides that beautiful, deep, dark shadow there, darkness. And this is a creative column base by Quinlan Terry, contemporary classical architect, but it's the same design. You have the minor torus, you have a Scotia, and you have the major torus. And here to the side, you can see it's unembellished. Here, you can see the same thing. That's the Scotia. Okay. Our next molding is the conge. The conge. So let's draw that one together. Conge. And a conge is kind of a unique case of the cavetto, is a good way to look at it. So we can draw a guiding circle here, like we did with the cavetto. And the conge really is a cavetto, but one side of it blends with the adjoining surface. So it's a unique case. So we might have a wall surface up here, and then we have a cavetto, but instead of having a fillet or something here, the surface just keeps going and it blends with the adjoining surface. That's the conge. So we can draw our shape here, and that's the conge molding. And let's shade the solid part together. That's the conge. It's usually semicircular, but sometimes you'll see elliptical shapes. It's not uncommon. Okay. Keep moving. So here we are, the conge. It's a concave molding, as I said, with one edge blended to the adjoining surface, either above or below. It's often seen at the base of columns, where it mediates between the column shaft and the base moldings at the column capital. So it mediates between the shaft and the astragal above. Sorry. I needed to share my screen. Forgive me. So here's a good example. This is a column capital, ionic column capital, and you can see the column shaft comes up, and then there's a conge molding right there. You very often see it in that kind of situation on column capitals. Here we can see another example on this fascia at St. Monica's. At the top of it, there's a conge molding right there. You can see it in profile here at the joint between the two stone pieces. That's a conge. Okay, hang in there. We've got just a couple more to go. Finally, we have the compound moldings, which are complex shapes that have both concave and convex regions. Sometimes they're called inflected moldings. And the first two of these are really important moldings that I want you to remember. And the first one is the cyma recta. The cyma recta is a very important compound molding. So let's draw that one together. And I will share my screen for you. The cyma recta. Cyma recta means, cyma means wave, so cyma recta means upright wave. And the cyma recta combines both a concave aspect and a convex aspect. In its normal orientation, the cyma recta, let's start with a fillet at the top here. The cyma recta has the concave portion at the top and then the convex portion at the bottom. That's the cyma recta. So we can draw our 45-degree extensions here if we like. Draw that fillet. And again, convex at the bottom, concave at top. And then we'll draw another fillet. And that's a cyma recta. The curvature can be circular, it can be elliptical. You'll see lots of different variations of it. Oftentimes I feel like they look a lot better if they are not circular. Circular shapes end up becoming very bulbous, you know, kind of funny. Much better, a little softer, more elliptical, because the shape becomes a little more lyrical, a little nicer. Okay, so we can draw our, shade our solid portion together. Like that. And that's the cyma recta. Okay, so let's talk about the cyma recta a little bit. And it's best for us to look at the cyma recta and consider its analog, which is the cyma reversa. So we'll look at the cyma reversa together as well. And let's go draw that one, the cyma reversa. So again, Cyma reversa. Cyma means wave. So Cyma reversa, of course, means reverse wave. Sorry, I was going a little fast there. There we go. And it's kind of the geometric analog of its twin, the Cyma recta. The Cyma reversa is similar in combining both convex and concave portions, but in its normal orientation, let's draw a little fillet here, it has the convex portion at the top and the concave portion at the bottom, like that. That's the Cyma reversa. Concave at the bottom and convex at the top. And often surrounded by fillets, like we see there. And we can shade the solid portion. That's the Cyma reversa. So let's go learn about those a bit. And that will bring us to the end of our talk tonight. You've all been very good and patient. So as I said, the Cyma reversa means reverse or turned back wave. It's a common supporting molding element. It's often used as a bed molding in the canonical version of the major orders. It's often embellished with vegetal decorations. Sometimes we'll see a leaf in dart or a tongue in dart. And we'll talk about that a bit next week. So here's some examples. This is a beautiful ink wash rendering by my good friend Steve Shriver. And you can see here the crowning molding up here is a Cyma recta, almost always seen in a crowning condition where that concave upper portion reaches out into the sky. We can also see under here a bed molding. It's a little hard to see. We've got a better example of that. So here we are. This is a plate from William Chambers, his Ionic order, and we can see the corona at the top here, or the cymation, I should say, the crowning molding at the top is a Cyma recta. And the molding here, this bed molding under the dental band, is a Cyma reversa. So this has convex at the top, concave at the bottom. This has concave at the top, convex at the bottom. And so the Cyma reversa is almost bulging out at the top because it's supporting something above it. So it makes sense as supporting molding. Up here, the Cyma recta reaches out into the sky. It's delicate and light. And so it's appropriate as a crowning molding. A few more examples. Here's a construction shot on one of my projects. You can see the gutter here in copper. It'll eventually be painted white. But that's a Cyma reversa molding. And similarly, under the dental band here, this bed molding is a Cyma reversa. Cyma recta, Cyma reversa. And another example of civic building here in Long Beach. And this is this crowning molding up here is a cyma recta. It's that molding that's reaching out delicately into the sky. Sometimes you can quirk these moldings. We talked about quirks where the curvature kind of keeps going and creates another shadow line. These are examples of quirked cyma recta and quirked cyma reversas. And it's just a way of making the molding even more expressive. So one way to understand the geometry of these two moldings and their ethos is by seeing them as segments of a sine curve. So for those of you that can remember your high school math class, here's a bit of trigonometry. As you may recall, the sine function generates this undulating curve, which oscillates back and forth on either side of an origin axis in a wave-like manner. So keep that shape in mind as we look at the next slide. Keeping that curve in mind, we can see that the cyma moldings are sections of a sine curve. The cyma recta is constructed as a horizontal sine curve. So section, a piece of a horizontal sine curve, as appropriate for a crowning element because the geometry emphasizes horizontal outward motion. The cyma reversa molding, conversely, is constructed as a vertical sine curve, as we can see over here on the left. As appropriate for a supporting element, the geometry emphasizes vertical upward motion against the loads above. Okay, you all have been so patient. I've gone so far over my time, but I love talking about this. This concludes part one of the introduction to the classical moldings. Thank you all so much for attending the talk tonight. I'll be teaching part two of this class next week. You are now familiar with all the basic shapes, the kit of parts that make up the elements of classical architecture. Next week, we'll talk about strategies for using those parts to create evocative architecture. We'll cover decorative embellishment of the moldings, decoration of the moldings. We'll talk about how the moldings are used to communicate an allegory of structure. And we'll explore concepts which can help guide us when we're designing with moldings. So I hope you enjoyed the class tonight. Thank you for supporting ICAA education. I'm really grateful. See you all next week. I'm going to stop my share now, and we can, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Also next week, more than happy to answer any questions then as well.
If anyone has a question, just type it into the Q&A box.
And it appears that I've been so thorough that there are no questions, which is fine. Happy to do this again next week. So
you have a couple there.
Oh, here they're flowing in. That's good. That's good. Caitlin asks, what is the name of the church in LA? Right now, I think it's called it's got a new name. It used to be called the Second Church of Christ Scientists. It was a Christian Science church. So if you look up Second Church of Christ Scientists, you'll find it. It's in the West Adams district. Really worth a visit. You can walk all around it. It's really a wonderful building. Is there a recording available for review? Probably. I know we've been recorded, so
yeah, and I can just let you know. So all of our webinars are recorded, and they will be available on the website. We usually say allow 4 to 6 weeks for that.
Great. Okay. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking about it. I'm sorry I went so long over, but go have some dinner. Next week's class will not be a drawing class, so I'll just be lecturing and showing PowerPoint. So it'll go a bit quicker, and we'll really talk about the philosophy of moldings and things you should keep in mind when designing with molding. So I look forward to talking to you then.